Hello, in this technical assistance recording, we're going to be reviewing the authority's GATA-compliant budget as well as some critical budget concepts. Let's get started on those now. Allowability of all costs charged to authority agreements follows the federal guidelines. This is the web address for the Department of Justice federal guidelines. This is several hundred pages and is very, very detailed. Well, you're welcome to look at that. Let's look at some of the basic principles that we use that you'll find in those guidelines. All program costs must be necessary to the performance of the project. They must be reasonable. They must be incurred during the grant period of performance. They must be adequately documented. They must be permissible under state and federal law and regulation. Program costs may not result in a profit, and they may only be claimed against one award. There has sometimes been confusion, particularly over travel costs. Some grantees have thought that if they have a conference that they want to send their staff to that happens after the period of performance, but if they pay for the airline and they pay for the hotel and they give their staff member their per diem before the end of the period of performance, so in advance of that conference, that those costs are allowable. They are not. All costs must be incurred during the period of performance, and all of the activity that they support must take place during the period of performance. Another piece of confusion is sometimes while you may find that an item is strictly allowable, it may fail the test of being reasonable and necessary. For instance, if you want to send a staff member to 5 conferences a year, we're going to ask if all 5 of those conferences are necessary and if that's reasonable to send someone away 5 times a year. So while travel costs might be strictly allowable, the 5 times a year might fail the test of reasonable and necessary. Here's another question for you. Agency A has budgeted grant funds to procure a new laptop computer for a grant-funded staff member. The grant period of performance begins October 1st, 2017. Can that agency place the order for the computer in September of 2017? The answer is no. All costs must be incurred and all activities must take place after the start date and before the end date of the period of performance. Here are some strictly unallowable costs. Those include costs to lease implementing agency-owned equipment, the rent of agency-owned space, any interest, as I said, costs incurred before or after the period of performance. Fundraising is an unallowable cost, as is lobbying. As I said before, this is not an exhaustive list. It's the federal guidelines that determine allowability, as well as those concepts that we just reviewed. Let's take a look at travel costs. The state travel guidelines govern the costs that may be charged to the agreement, and this is the address where you can get that travel guide. The current state travel rates, and those rates are changed every year. The mileage reimbursement is 53.5 cents per mile. Per diem is only paid for overnight travel. The in-state per diem is charged at $7 per quarter of the day, and out-of-state travel is charged at $8 per quarter of the day. Now, lodging rates are a little more complicated. The state travel guidelines, that address that I gave you just a little while ago, they establish the maximum lodging rates for the different areas of Illinois. But maximum lodging rates outside of Illinois are governed by the Federal General Services, or GSA, their guidelines, and here's the address for that. And actually that's a great website because you can just type in the city or the zip code that you're planning to travel to, and it will bring up the list of the maximum lodging rates, and those change throughout the course of the year. You'll also see on that site though that they give you the federal per diem rates. Those federal per diem rates do not apply to authority agreements. You must use the out-of-state travel per diem of $8 per quarter of the day. Now, a couple of things to remember when you're looking at the actual budget template. We're asking you to complete all of the tabs, to fill in all of the blue shaded cells. You'll see that grayed out cells are not applicable. Now, we're asking you to submit your budget as a completed Excel file. No signatures are necessary at the time of application, so we don't want to see any PDFs of the printout and the signed budget. We're only asking for the Excel file. Let's take a look at that template now. You'll see there are quite a few tabs in this new GATA compliant budget. This is the first tab, Section A. As I said before, you're going to be completing the blue cells. You'll get the information on the CSFA and the CSFA short description and the NOFO ID. You'll get those all from the NOFO document itself. You'll leave the grant number blank because the grant number will only be assigned after a grant is approved by our budget committee. So you'll fill in this top, and then this information will populate on all the other cells, so you just have to type it once. And in this blue cell, remember I said that it's the blue cells that you're going to be completing. You're going to fill in the total amount that you're requesting from the authority here. Now, one thing that you'll see as we go through, all of these white cells are calculated. You can't edit them. One thing a lot of people miss too is down here at the bottom, these blue cells, if you are budgeting an indirect cost to this agreement, you will need to fill in this blue cell down here where you'll complete both the rate and the base, which is the MTDC. You'll see that there's another technical assistance recording that goes into detail on how to calculate your MTDC. So take a look at that one as well. The second tab is indirect cost information. So there are 5 options here. So this is the option if you are electing to charge the federally negotiated indirect cost rate that your agency has already received. If you are selected for a grant, you will need to provide proof of that current rate. So we'll need to see a letter from your federally cognizant agency, but don't send that in now. We'll ask you for it if we do negotiate an agreement with you. Box 2 is if you either have a negotiated indirect cost rate with the state of Illinois, or if you do not have an indirect cost rate with the state of Illinois but are intending to begin those negotiations. You would check one of these 2 boxes. Box 3 is for the de minimis, this flat 10% indirect cost rate. We'll go into more detail again in that indirect cost rate recording. Box 4 is not applicable because we do not place any restrictions on indirect costs. Box 5 is where you'll check if you are electing not to charge any indirect costs for this agreement at all. If you do have a negotiated rate, either a state rate or a federally granted indirect cost rate, you'll also need to complete this blue box here. If you are not electing to charge an indirect cost, or if you're choosing to go with the 10% de minimis rate, you would not need to complete that section of the tab. This is matching funds. It's like that first tab that we saw where if you do budget of matching contribution, if there's one required, you'll be completing these cells indicating whether that match contribution is cash, non-cash, or other contributions. You will see that if there is a matching requirement, it'll already be completed for you here. The other cells populate from the other tabs. So it's just those 3 blue cells if you have a matching funds requirement. This is the applicant certification. As I said before, we don't want you to sign it now, but we would like you to fill in the other blanks for us, the name of the institution, the name of the official, and their title. And we need both the executive officer and the chief financial officer for the implementing agency. And we need the executive officer for the program agency as well. For a definition of the difference between an implementing agency and a program agency, please review our general guidelines technical assistance recording. This is the FFATA form, which is only necessary if the NOFO that you are applying for uses federal funds. It's pretty self-explanatory. But I think the only thing you really probably need a little more guidance on is if you can check no to this question, then you don't have to complete question 2. So everybody has to answer, if it's a federal grant, everybody has to answer question 1. If you check yes, then you must complete question 2. Now we'll get to the actual budget categories. This is the personnel line item, and I'm just going to briefly show you how the form works on the personnel page. So we're going to say that this staff member is to be determined because you haven't hired them yet. And let's say they're an advocate. And they make $5,000 per month. They're going to be charged 50% to this agreement, and they're going to work 12 months. And you'll see that the form will calculate for you in the total cost column. However, you're going to need to go back and fill in whether this $30,000 is going to be charged to the federal or to the match. Now let's look at another employee, and we'll say this is an investigator, and the investigator makes $5,000. Well, let's do that differently. He makes $60,000 a year. He's going to work 100% time on this program, and he's going to work for 1 year. So that's what's going to make your calculations come out correctly, is if you have the rate, you have to put in the number of, if it's a year, you have to put in, is it a whole year? If it's on the monthly basis, how many months? So these two columns in particular need to correspond. So now I'm going to figure out that I'm going to charge this guy to federal. This advocate is going to be charged to match. Now, also on each budget category tab, you'll see that there is personnel narrative. There is a narrative box. And this is where you're going to describe what that line item, so in this case, what those personnel will do, why they're necessary for the program, and tell me how you figured out, how you estimated those costs. So you might say that this is the standard starting salary for an advocate position here. You might say that you're looking for a senior investigator, and this is the standard wage for a senior investigator at your agency. Those kinds of things. So probably the greatest number of comments that we get when an agreement is going through our internal fiscal and legal review is they're looking for more information in the narrative for each line item. So spend a little time in filling that in and really justifying how you develop those costs and why those costs are necessary. And then you'll see on the next tab, which is Fringe Benefits, it's already populated those staff positions from the personnel page, and they filled in their salary. Now, we've automatically filled in the FICA for each position, but it's going to be up to you to fill in the other fringe benefits. The ones that are categorized as other, we want you to fill in what exactly what that is. So if it's health insurance, for instance, you're going to fill that in, and then you're going to give us the rate. So if you pay 25% of salary is what you pay for your contribution to the agency's contribution, I should say, to the health insurance premium for your employees, you're going to fill that in here, and it's going to calculate for us. So let's go 0.25. See, it's going to fill that in for us. And so these are all rated fringe benefits, so those are percentage of salary, but there's also an option for a flat rate fringe benefit. For instance, if you pay $15,000 a year for health insurance, it's a flat rate, it's not based on salary, you're going to fill that in here, and you'll see that you're going to fill in that number in the blue box here. Don't forget the narrative. And you'll see that those totals have already calculated over here. But again, you're going to have to proportion those between federal and match. Here's the page for travel expenses. And it calculates the same way as the personnel, where you're going to fill in, let's say we're going to do mileage. And the cost rate is 0.535. And the quantity is going to be 200 miles. It's a long trip. So we get miles. Number of staff, I'm going to just do 1. Number of trips, 1. And it's going to calculate the cost for me. Again, you have to remember to apportion those costs between the federal and match, and be sure to fill in the narrative. Equipment. Now, an item is only a piece of equipment if it has a unit cost of $5,000 or more. So your laptop computer is not going to be equipment. A car is, because it's all based on the unit costs. Also, it's quite frequent that anything that is going to appear on the equipment page, for instance, a car, might be prorated. So be sure to only charge to the agreement that share of it that is of this equipment item that will be used by the program or by the program staff. Now, supplies. The laptop computer does count as a supply item. Again, it's going to be you're going to figure the quantity of it and the so you would have one laptop computer, $800. It's going to calculate for you. If it is an item that is going to be shared, you're going to have to prorate it based on the share of that item that is going to be used for the program. Now we're on the contractual page. So say you're going to have a contractual staff member, and you can fill that in here. The cost per basis, say they're going to make $1,000 a week, but they're only going to work for 26 weeks for you. And they're going to be 100% of this program. Again, it's going to calculate for you. Don't forget to figure out what's federal and what's match, and to fill in the narrative. Now we come to the indirect cost page, and again, I would encourage you to listen to the indirect cost technical assistance recording. So there's only one line item here. This is where you're going to tell me what type of indirect cost that you are going to charge to the agreement. So you might say that you have a federal indirect cost rate of 24%, and you are going to, so here's your 24%. 24%, and say the base, your total MTDC is going to be $100,000, and it's going to calculate for you. And down here, you're going to tell me exactly what's going to be included in your MTDC. Again, you'll find that there are lines for signatures where we don't want any signatures at this point, so you can fill in the information of the organization, the official, their title. Please leave the signature and the date of the signature blank. The summary tab, and you can see that I have a lot more work to do on this budget because I have a total budgeted amount of $184,492, but I haven't figured out all these other line items, how I'm going to share those costs between the federal and the match amount. This is for authority use only, so leave that blank. And then the final tabs are much more detailed instructions regarding the budget. One last note is that in previous NOFOs, some applicants have submitted questions saying that this budget is not the correct budget because they've filled in GATA budgets for other state agencies, and it doesn't look like this. This is a GATA approved budget, so we took the basic template from the folks at GATA, and we made some modifications to fit the authority programs. So that's all for the budget. Please be sure to listen to the other technical assistance recordings that are required for this NOFO.